It will be given by Chelsea Hasenauer. She's the senior manager at the Climate Registry. She leads the greenhouse gas and water-related measurement, reporting, and verification initiatives there. She authors and maintains measurement, reporting, and verification protocols, and also leads the development of new policy, guidance, and tools to support organizations in managing their emissions. She will discuss the development of a net zero portal, which will provide essential information on carbon neutrality pledges and pathways so that organizations and jurisdictions can build capacity and the public can better understand their claims. Please join me in welcoming Chelsea. Thank you for coming here to present virtually to present your talk.
Happy to. Thank you so much for the introduction. Happy to be here. And I guess just before I jump in, I am hoping to get a little bit of audience input on who knows about the Climate Registry already. If you have any familiarity with our work in our organization, we are a tiny nonprofit. We do pack a big punch, but I want to get a sense of who has background about TCR. So if you could raise your hand or give a little reaction, thumbs up or whatever else to let me know if you know about TCR, that would be helpful. I like the crying, laughing. Okay, so it seems like relatively few people. So that's great. I am going to share some slides, so let me get those up now, and I'll start by giving a little bit of background about what TCR is and what we do. And then we can get into the benefits of measurement, reporting, and verification for carbon neutrality policy development. Let's see. Oh, there we go. Okay, just to start, the Climate Registry was actually born out of California state legislation back in the early 2000s. The state of California recognized that there was a big push for organizations across sectors to measure their greenhouse gas emissions, and they were doing that voluntarily at the time. And there was a lot of inconsistency on the approach that folks were taking to measure their emissions, especially across sectors and things like that. So the state of California passed legislation that directed California state agencies to create an organization to basically standardize GHG measurement, reporting, and verification expectations across sectors. So we have been operating as an organization since that early California legislation, but after AB 32 was passed in California, which is the mandatory reporting regulation, among many other regulations that have come out of that, that required certain businesses and facilities that met a certain threshold of greenhouse gas emissions to then measure and disclose their own emissions to the state. The Climate Registry actually broke away from a state-specific reporting registry and standard setting body, and we became a North America-wide standard setter. So we now operate as a North America-wide program that sets standards for GHG measurement and reporting and verification across sectors. And we provide a number of different services, which are outlined here on this slide. The first one is building capacity in GHG MRV, which is essentially providing the standards and the training that organizations, regardless of size or sector, that they might need to use to understand their carbon footprint, as well as to manage it. Besides that, we also aim to showcase leadership across North America. So we provide a lot of recognition opportunities and other marketing tools to organizations who want to tell their story, and of course aim to do that in a way that avoids any hint of greenwashing as much as possible. And then outside of that, we also support more ambitious climate action by developing new and innovative tools. And those tools span a number of different uses and scopes. So I'll get into those in a second. But just to start, that place where we came from as a standard setter for building consistency around GHG MRV continues to be the bread and butter of our work and what we do. First and foremost, we provide protocols at a general scale, like I've said, that can be used across sectors and organization sizes, but we also do provide sector-specific protocols. So we have an electric power sector protocol that's provided to organizations that generate electric power so that they can understand the specific emission sources associated with their operations, and of course to appropriately report for and reduce or manage the emissions associated with those sources. We also provide a protocol that's specific to the water energy nexus in California that's geared towards water managers here in the southwest of the US, because there is such a water scarcity issue, and the water use and the water that is delivered to that area of the country is very energy intensive. And outside of that, we provide protocols for local governments and small businesses as well. So we have a few sector-specific resources to get into sources that maybe are unique to different types of organizations, in addition to our general guidance. And then beyond that, guidance for measuring greenhouse gas emissions and figuring out how to report it appropriately or disclose it in the public space. We also provide standards for organizations to get their carbon footprint verified. And that's done by a third-party auditor to make sure that the process is done with high accuracy and that there's no conflict of interest between the reviewer or the auditor and the organization who has created the greenhouse gas inventory. So we build all of these protocols through a multi-stakeholder consensus-based approach, which means that we lead the process of authoring the protocols by conducting early research and understanding the policy landscape and the capabilities of the organizations who will be asking to measure, report, and verify their emissions. But we also convene very large stakeholder groups to review and provide feedback on our process throughout. So those stakeholder groups generally focus on the sector that we are serving with the protocol, but it might also be something much more broad than that. So including policymakers from the state and local level, or the nonprofit organizations or other types of industry associations that might have relevant input to contribute to the process as well. And throughout that stakeholder consultation that we do with to create a consensus-based approach to standard setting, we meet regularly with these stakeholders to ask them key questions and interview them, and then always release our protocols and standards for public comment as well. So that means that the draft version of the tool or standard is put out to the public sphere for at least a month or so, so that folks can respond and provide feedback before anything is ever finalized. And then from there, our standards are used pretty widely, of course, I think very commonly by academia and also utilities, as I already mentioned, since those are some of our sectors that we focus on, but it is also used by corporate America quite a bit as well. So we get to work with a wide range of organizations to build these credible standards. And beyond that standard setting that we do as an organization, I mentioned that we provide innovative new tools to support ambition and climate action. So a few different examples are provided here on the screen. The most recent work that we did was with USAID, and it was support provided to the Thailand government organization to help them build a greenhouse gas measurement, reporting, and verification tool for their organizations in Thailand. So that was wonderful, and that was actually based off of the Climate Registry's own in-house GHG MRV tool, which is called the Climate Registry Information System. So we've been building tools to support calculating carbon footprints, as well as credibly disclosing them to the public and undergoing that third-party audit for quite a long time. So now we're using that experience that we have with standard setting for GHG measurement, reporting, and verification, and the development of innovative new tools to get into the discussion about how it is that we are going to get to net zero. And given the focus that I've already mentioned in supporting organizations specifically in what they're going to do to get to net zero, or to manage their own emissions, and then hopefully to get to net zero in their own operations, our focus in getting to net zero is specifically on that, on the actors and what their actions will be to set appropriate targets and then take credible and aggressive actions to meet those targets. So there's obviously a lot of talk in the broader sense about what it means to get to net zero and an economy-wide scale. And there's certainly different focuses on net zero of specific products or project level accounting, but we're focusing specifically on the organization's entire carbon footprint, so the entity-wide carbon footprint from operations. And we're hoping to help organizations set net zero targets and meet them. So that's where we're focusing our efforts. And what we know when we began to wade into this process is that organizations across sectors have many different approaches to setting these targets. There is a lot of difference outside of just the 3 ways that are listed here on the screen, but primarily in the time frame that folks are using to set a target, meaning how long will it take them to get to net zero, as well as the scope of activities that are included in the target and the mitigation approaches that they're using to meet the targets. So we just heard a lot of great information coming out of American University. They got into all the details of the specifics of their target, which is great. And of course, if we were to look at an organization in another sector, things would look quite different, I'm sure, both in time frame and the scope of activities, but especially in the mitigation approaches that are chosen by that other organization. So given these varied approaches and the many different certifications that are out there and the terminology that's being used to make carbon neutral claims, we are hoping to, again, use our roots to standardize what these commitments and claims mean and help to build standardized and consistent boundaries about what an organization means when they say that they're committing to carbon neutral or net zero, and what is expected of them in terms of transparency around their approach and pathway for getting there. So as you saw on that last slide, there's a lot out there already, and that's only a very small subset of the different types of certifications that are being used in the space and the different types of terms that are being adopted by organizations to make claims about their actions. So what we are hoping to do is build a place where we can have transparent disclosure of carbon neutral and net zero pledges and the pathways that organizations are using to achieve them. And we would like to be sure that within that space, there's a standardized criteria and terminology for communication so that we can compare and contrast the differences between those carbon neutral and net zero commitments and strategies. And within that, we hope that also we can provide resources to organizations to both begin on the process of setting a target, as well as understand the most effective mitigation strategies and reduction measures that they might use given their sector and other context that affects their organization. So given all of that and what's needed to just sort of bring consistency to how these carbon neutral targets are set and how folks are going to get there, we're working to develop a net zero portal, as was mentioned earlier. And this will be a global database for tracking net zero pledges and pathways. And again, that's at the organization or entity-wide scale. So organizations like American University can then register their net zero or carbon neutral commitment within the portal and provide transparency around the pathways that they've chosen to get to that commitment. So in order to develop this net zero portal, we're using our general process that I introduced at the beginning for multi-stakeholder consensus-based approach to building tools and resources. We are engaging a very large group of stakeholders. We've got a working group of about 20 different organizations and an advisory committee of about 40. So overall, about 60 different organizations. Several have multiple representatives participating in this process. And we have been meeting with this large group of stakeholders over the course of about a year now to develop this central, comprehensive, and easily navigable repository for carbon neutral and net zero pledges and pathways. And what we've been talking with these groups about is how we will define the transparency expectations for these pledges and what it is that we want to see about their pathways in order for there to be effective exchange of information between organizations across different sectors so that new mechanisms and approaches are made available to organizations who are still just starting out on the process and are trying to figure out exactly how it is that they'll meet targets that they set or that they would like to set. So there will be a few different major pillars of this net zero portals. One big aspect is the repository of pledges and pathways that I just mentioned, and that will be the place where pledges and the approaches to meet those pledges are listed and can be compared and contrasted. Then there will be a resource library that will also support the repository of pledges and pathways. And that resource library will include standards from organizations like the Climate Registry, as well as other more specific to net zero itself. So that might be things like the carbon neutral protocol, which comes from Natural Capital Partners, or the pending standard for carbon neutrality, which will come out of the International Standard Setting Organization, and potentially also standards from organizations like the Science Based Targets Initiative and things along those lines, so that we have guidance and information available directly in the portal that can be linked to pledges that are listed in the portal as well. And those can be used to sort of back up claims that are made within the database, as well as a learning opportunity for folks who are looking for resources in specific topic areas. And then the final big piece of the portal, which will not necessarily be a standalone page, but will be sort of interwoven throughout each of the other relevant pages, is opportunities for collaboration. And this is to ensure that, again, there's a really easy exchange of information across the organizations who participate in the portal and disclose their pledges and pathways. And we're hoping that exchange of ideas will encourage organizations who are in different sectors to share their successes in terms of mitigation strategies that they've chosen, or the challenges as well, so that organizations in different sectors are introduced to new avenues to address their emissions and new standards that they might need to be upheld to in the future. So to build that vision, the net zero portal, in those major pillars, as I mentioned, we're using this consensus-based approach. We've had a number of meetings, and one of the main things that we focused on was examining the expectations that we have for organizations in terms of transparency around their net zero or carbon neutral commitment. So what is it exactly that a observer might want to understand about a carbon neutral commitment in order to feel assured that it isn't just a wishy-washy or greenwashed claim? And so we've been defining minimum expectations with the group, and have learned, of course, the challenges with defining those minimum expectations across sectors. And I'll get to what we've pulled out as something that's somewhat fair as minimum expectations, despite the fact that it's hard to consolidate. And we've also talked through ways that we can showcase the most credible and robust strategies from this process as well. So as I mentioned, the comparing commitments across standards becomes very challenging because different sectors have different opportunities to reduce their emissions. There's different types of low-hanging fruit to be mitigated most easily within different sectors. And there's certain sectors that at this time just have unavoidable residual emissions that we simply don't have the technology available to address yet. So as innovation catches up, we're looking at different ways that those emissions can be addressed. Obviously, offsets is a pillar that is used frequently, but ultimately we can't set standards across the board for how it is that offsets should be applied or what is most appropriate for any one sector to set. So we're trying to be inclusive within this portal so that we have as much disclosure as possible from organizations across sectors so that we can then allow users to compare, contrast, and categorize. So the focus, instead of trying to determine what specifically is expected for a carbon neutral or net zero target, we're focusing on transparency, encouraging as much transparency as possible to allow for users to make their own judgments. So transparency will mean that we allow for context setting around pledges and pathways, meaning there will be a lot of information about the organization itself, outside of just its sector, but its size and the types of operations that it manages, as well as its location and its main constituents and things like that, because all of those play a major role in the type of net zero or carbon neutral claim that an organization can set. And then, of course, the approaches that they can take to mitigating those emissions. Outside of context setting, we also want to provide detailed information on the approaches themselves. I think we've all seen that there is just a myriad of different pledges out there at the moment. It seems like everybody's suddenly made a carbon neutral commitment, but there's less information about exactly how it is that each organization is going to meet that commitment or achieve that net zero target. So we're going to focus most transparency aspects of this net zero portal on exactly that. What are the approaches being used to address emissions, and on what time scale are those things being implemented? What are the priority items being taken care of first, and when do the next aspects of a plan get put into place? We'll also provide a consensus-based glossary. A lot of that will be based on standards provided by the IPCC or ISO. So those are the international standard setting bodies for climate-related terminology. So we'll be including that glossary right in the net zero portal so that folks can understand the differences between the different terms that organizations are using to set targets and compare and contrast the different boundaries of those terms. And we'll also be allowing sort of a user-defined glossary, since we've seen so many new terms pop up over the last few years as more corporate actors begin to make claims and their marketing teams get excited about how to make their claims or commitments flashy to larger groups of stakeholders. So things like carbon positive or carbon negative or carbon plus or zero carbon or things like that that have been sort of coined by corporate actors over the last few years and are becoming more popular will also be defined within the glossary, but those are not terms that have international standard setting backing or definitions associated with them. So they'll be in a separate glossary that is, again, user defined, but can still provide context. And as I think, the last thing I wanted to mention is that we won't be providing any sort of ranking or assessment within this net zero portal. because we're focusing on transparency entirely, and because it's difficult to set a standard for minimum expectations across sectors, we will be instead expecting that the user make their own judgments about the different types of claims being made within the portal. So our goal is to provide as much information as a user might need to make an assessment about the credibility of a pledge on their own. And the few areas that we have will provide some direction about what we believe to be credible will be these things listed here, which is that the boundaries of a target should include at least scope 1 and 2 emissions globally for an organization, and there should be complete transparency about scope 3 emissions, meaning we should at least see some sort of stock taking for scope 3 emissions with transparency about what an organization's plans are to address those emissions, whether it be now or in the future. And then, of course, because of the international understanding that we need to curb emissions well before 2050, we also expect that organizations are setting targets in line with that time frame. And outside of those general expectations for the boundaries of a target itself, we want to see that organizations are annually reporting or publicly disclosing a third-party verified inventory on an annual basis. And that's to ensure that we can all verify progress towards their target, or if they've claimed that they've already made or met their target, that they are maintaining that net zero status or standard. So in addition to that annual transparency, we also want to see that folks are addressing their, choosing appropriate pathways to address their GHGs. And in order to do that, we want to see, just as was talked about at American University, first a focus on internal reductions and actual management of emissions associated with an organization's own operations, before we turn to any sort of external market mechanism or different purchasing option that might lead to reductions elsewhere, but that they can claim. So rather than using offsets or RECs or things like that, we want to see transition to a decarbonized operation strategy and less emissions that result from the organization directly. So these are some general expectations that we have at a very broad level. I think that most people who are involved in this space would say that they want to see much more than this from organizations, especially those in sectors who have been highly scrutinized and who are getting a lot of climate finance at the moment. So this is just our sort of base level of things that from our consensus-based process, we've all understood to be important for us to move towards. And I think that with that, I'll just close to say that our process for developing the framework for this net zero portal is now closing up. So we'll be releasing a framework for it within the next couple of months, and it will be released for public comment, just like the rest of our standards are. So if you're interested in contributing, please feel free to follow our work. There's certainly contact information available on our website, and you'll be notified when that framework is released for public comment. And we'd love to hear your thoughts on what should be expected in the net zero portal.
Thank you. Very impressive undertaking, I must say. Are there any questions from the audience at this point? So there's one question. So in addition to now offering this portal as a platform for, starting the activity, getting the needed help, etc., do you also provide what you started out with, where you actually individually work with an organization to usher them through this process? Are you still maintaining that activity? Or?
Yeah, the climate registry's general programs are still up and running. So the protocols that we've established are still publicly available on our website for use. And the organizations who are members of the climate registry, which means they voluntarily report their emissions to us, and we support their verification process, is still active as well. So it's likely that this net zero portal will be an extension of that program so that our organizations who are already registering and disclosing their emissions have support in taking the next step.
So two questions. First, do you yourself have in your group experts in all these different areas, or do you maintain I would say a collection of experts all over the US or around the world to validate some of these things? That's the first question. And then I'll ask the second question after that.
Sure, yeah. We have a very small team at the climate registry, and I would say that most of our staff is are generalists, and that we're very well versed in greenhouse gas accounting and how that can be applied to organizations across different sectors, or even at different scales to projects or products. But we maintain also a global network, I would say, of other experts outside our organization, because we're constantly running these multi-stakeholder processes. So we rely on external organizations and participants for that. They can be consultants or representatives from academia. We have a lot of action there. And of course, as I mentioned earlier, utilities are a big part of our process as well. So our network of global experts is primarily external to us partners.
So the next question was around the economics of getting into these activities, and so is there any resource that you make available to people where they wanted to plan for these activities and understand how much they have to commit over the number of years in terms of financial resources in addition to planning for it? Or...
Yeah, we don't provide a lot on financial resources because, again, that's something that will be so varied from sector to sector and depending on the organization size. The goal of the climate registry's work and the standards that we provide, and besides the standards, that the guidance and support that we offer to organizations, is to keep costs as low as possible. So relying on public resources and support from a nonprofit organization is certainly more cost effective than hiring consultants or even hiring your own full-time staff or team. So the idea with our work is to make things as easy and unburdensome as possible. That said, certainly none of this is easy, and there does require to be a lot of pretty hefty investments for organizations that need to transition the technologies that they're using, or even the choices that they're making in terms of operations to be more efficient, or to require less resources and things like that. So we don't have standard guidance for that, but provide support that's specific to the needs of the organization.
Yeah, because one of the things I do notice is that there's just some sticker shock that people feel when they want to get into this area and commit to something that they really believe in, and then want to commit to it. But then there is, okay, you need, so much to get to the first level, etc., etc.
Right.
And so if there is a comparison between, okay, if you commit this much, these are the gains you will have in terms of even return on investment, etc. That would be actually substantial, I would say, in getting even small businesses, etc., to
Yeah,
line up
absolutely.
for this year. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I know that there are quite a few consulting firms that work with specific sectors who do develop resources like that.
Okay. Yeah. But yeah, thank you. This was a very comprehensive presentation, and thank you for telling us about it. So very nice. Yeah.
Yeah,
Thank
thank
you.
you.
Yeah. So we'll move